He leaned over to me and he said, if there's one more conversation about the definition of impact investing, I'm going to shoot myself. Like a minute or so after that, the guy who was moderating the panel said, okay, well, Harald, tell me, what's your definition of impact investing? My answer was, I think we should make nuclear energy a recognized impact investing category. Half the room was laughing out loud, and the other half of the room, they were like aghast. It's like, how could you say something like this? Large investors do not allocate capital simply on the basis that it's categorized as green or sustainable. They make investments based on risk-return considerations. The world of responsible investment seem to rely on the idea of apportioning blame. It's like, we want to know who's responsible for getting these emissions out. It's always like a company. It's never us because we drive cars and we fly to Bali. No, it's an oil company. I think the world really just doesn't work that way.
You, my friend, are an Amsterdammer, but I think you went to grammar school at the Rhinelands Lyceum Utrecht. So did you grow up more in the Leiden area?
Yes, that's correct. I was actually born in Leiden and grew up near Leiden. Also spent a couple of years at the Bronxville Elementary School in New York. My father worked for the United Nations, so there's also a bit of American background there, but most of my youth was in or near Leiden.
But then eventually you studied law in Leiden University. And what was the idea to follow law? I mean, where did that come from?
It seemed like a good place to start. I think, so you've lived in the Netherlands, and in the Netherlands, maybe contrary to the US, actually a lot of people see law school as a nice kind of starting point. You go to law school, and then after that, you'll figure out what you do. And, you have a lot of different options. Lawyers end up in all different kinds of fields. So actually not a whole lot of thinking went into that. It was only later in my studies that I started reflecting on this, like, oh, what do I actually do with my life?
But something happened that you ended up going to my hometown, Chicago, and you landed at University of Chicago in the Booth Business School, home of all things Milton Friedman. So something motivated you to get an MBA. So what was that about?
I enjoyed being a lawyer. At the same time, I was an advisor to all these corporations, and I thought, okay, what's really interesting is, I mean, putting these deals together is obviously interesting, but the rubber really just kind of hits the road after the deal is put together, because then the companies, start working together and integrating and all that sort of thing. And so I thought that that's kind of where I would like to end up. And I thought doing an MBA would be the best way of kind of making this leap. And so applied to a couple of business schools, and Chicago was kind of my preferred school. Was very happy to get in. Yeah, I had a fantastic time there. We stayed in. My wife came with me. And we, after completing my MBA, stayed in Chicago a couple of years. So it was a fantastic time living there and having this academic experience, and still stuff that I learned there that I think about every day and apply every day.
Right in the wake of the dot-com meltdown, you had your freshly minted MBA and landed at Bally Total Fitness. So explain that one.
It came as a bit of a surprise to some of the people who'd seen me go off to a business school as well. So what happened is, as I said, I was really interested in, landing with a corporation who was interested in doing mergers, acquisitions, joint ventures, and so forth. And so I talked to a couple of investment banks. I talked to consulting firms, kind of the more traditional MBA career routes. And then I met a guy called Lee Hillman, who was the CEO of the Bally Total Fitness Corporation, headquartered in Chicago. He was also a Chicago alum. He had a very interesting story, because he basically said, Bally Total Fitness is probably the largest health club company in the world, but we have operations exclusively in North America. He said, whenever I travel to Europe and Asia, I see opportunities everywhere for our company. And so you should come and work for me, and you're going to help me build, Bally Total Fitness into this international corporation. And so obviously that all sounded very exciting to me, even though, I'd never really thought about the fitness business, barely been in a health club before I went to Chicago. But so, the story and the ambition really appealed to me. And Lee Hillman seemed like a really great guy. So I went and joined Bally Total Fitness right out of business school.
And then you did about a 3-year stint there, and then eventually around 2004 landed at Aegon, a large asset manager, about $500 billion under management. So that's a big jump into an asset manager. What was behind all that?
What happened at Bally is that for about 2 or 3 years, we were actually very active, especially in Europe, also exploring opportunities in Asia. We built a joint venture with a UK-based company called Holmes Place, and they had an ambition to develop high-end clubs in the United States, so it was very complementary. This was working out very well, but then Lee Hillman actually left Bally and was replaced by a CEO who wasn't actually all that excited about this whole international strategy. I was told that he didn't even have a passport. He didn't really see any reason to leave the US. And so he also didn't care very much for this joint venture that we put together and all these plans that we had for Asia and Germany, Austria, and Spain. We had lots of ideas for locations for clubs and all that sort of thing. But he basically said, we're going to get rid of all that. And so that was basically what I was hired to do. So then it wasn't that interesting for me to work for Bally anymore. And at the same time, my wife and I started thinking about, at some point we wanted to go back to the Netherlands. I got in touch with the people at Aegon, and they were looking to build their business development team, especially with a view to doing, again, mergers and acquisitions, especially in Central Eastern Europe. And so that seemed to fit very well with what I was looking for, and so decided to join them. That has worked out very well. Actually ended up working with Aegon for 15 years in total, and that's also where I got into the whole ESG, responsible investment and impact investment story.
You ended up being the global head of responsible investment there. Was that their idea or your idea, or was it serendipitous or inevitable?
It certainly wasn't planned by anyone ahead of time. It was kind of all of the above. It was serendipitous in the sense that after doing 5 years of acquisitions in Central Eastern Europe, there was a little thing called the global financial crisis, where Aegon also received some support from the Dutch government. But one of the conditions there was that they couldn't do acquisitions as long as they were benefiting from this financial support. And so I was basically on the mergers and acquisitions team. I started doing some internal consulting in the firm, and one of the projects that I ended up spending a lot of time on was the setting up of Aegon Asset Management. Aegon was basically an insurance company, but there were also investment units kind of spread throughout the company. And there was a strategic decision at some point to turn this into a separate division, also with a view to, developing that more into one of the business lines contributing to the profits. And so I worked on that project from the, strategy department, and that took about a year, kind of developing the whole legal framework, the corporate governance framework, refining the corporate strategy, et cetera, et cetera. And in this process, I worked very closely with a guy called Erik van Houwelingen, who went on to then become the first CEO of Aegon Asset Management. And when this work was done and Aegon Asset Management was in fact launched, he said, "Why don't you now come and work for me? Because then you can help me actually implement everything that we've been putting together." And that seemed like, an exciting new adventure. And so I kind of made this internal move, and was also at that time, I'd also done a project on sustainability. I had this interest in these ideas about sustainability, responsible investment. So basically I asked Eric, would it be okay if, for some amount of time, I would then also figure out what all of this is about, and then maybe develop a strategy for Aegon Asset Management on responsible investment. And he said, "Yeah, that sounds great, and go for it. As long as you don't forget about all these other, 100 strategic and organizational initiatives that we have on our desk." So that's how it started.
Did you end up actually managing a portfolio there, managing assets, or were you not on the actual portfolio management end?
I was never responsible for managing portfolios. I worked quite closely with all the investment teams, and so was involved in some of the decision making around making investments, but I never managed assets myself, no.
You had a good long run at Aegon, but then 2019 you landed at Natixis as the head of ESG. How did that come about, and what were you doing there actually?
Again, it was a kind of situation where I felt that, pretty much everything there was to do in terms of, putting together a policy and team and doing a lot of, learning about all different kinds of investments, that was all kind of done at Aegon. So, I was still very content there, but at the same time, I felt that the learning curve had become a little bit less steep. Again, I got in touch with someone who was the CEO of Natixis Investment Managers at the time, a guy called Jean Raby. He told me about Natixis, but I think I'd never heard of the firm Natixis in my life. So what's unique about them, apart from their size, they're one of the largest asset managers in the world, but what's unique about them is their multi-affiliate model, where they have, I think at the time it was 23 asset managers that are part of the group, but they have a very high degree of independence. So it's not an integrated firm. These asset managers operate more or less independently in terms of, investment strategy and so forth. And so basically he said, I'm looking for someone who can sit at the sort of headquarter level, but is going to act as an advisor to all of these 23 asset management firms and help them figure out, what is ESG? How do they develop a policy? Or if they already have a policy, help them implement it, try and make sense of it. That seemed like a nice challenge and an opportunity to work with all of these different types of asset managers. So they're, equity and debts and private equity and alternatives and real estate and across Europe and across the US as well. And, Jean Raby seemed like a nice guy and someone who I could work with well. So I decided to make that jump.
You came up with the single most important thing that investors could do to address climate change. Tell me about that.
I wouldn't say that I came up with it, but so I was at a conference once. This was the question that was asked of me. It was about impact investing, and it was, what is the single most effective thing that we can do in order for impact investing to make a contribution to, real world outcomes or something like that. And so basically my answer then was, I think we should make nuclear energy like a recognized impact investing category. It was a little bit tongue in cheek, of course, but at the same time, it was also pretty much serious because, and I think there's now much more recognition for this, but I've been reading about climate change and energy transitions and all that sort of thing. It seemed to me like nuclear energy with essentially zero emissions should be kind of a big part of our toolbox. At that time, certainly in sort of ESG and impact circles, I think where people do have a certain sort of ethical lens through which they're looking at these things, maybe not everyone was on board with this idea yet. And so the response in the room, was quite a large room. And so like half the room was laughing out loud. And the other half of the room, you could see from where I was sitting on the stage, they were like aghast. It was like, how could you say something like this? But that's, I think, also kind of the type of mindset that appealed to Jean Raby. It was like, let's be clear about these things and, let's be evidence-based. If that's what science tells us, let's follow that. And that makes sense. Then that should make sense from an investment point of view as well.
I remember distinctly Mark Andreessen was saying, he says flat out, that people are not serious about climate change. He says, I don't talk about it because we have the solution. No one wants to talk about it. And he says it's nuclear, it's Gen 4. And he just says, if you do the calculations with how much real estate we're going to use with solar panels and wind farms and all that, he goes, we're not going to get there. But no one wants to talk about it. But every time I bring it up, it's like throwing a smelly sock on the table. So I don't do it much, at least not in polite company, so. But anyway, interesting story that was the reaction for you as well. Then you went independent around 2022, which is the whole reason why we're talking today and takes us to what you're doing now. And you established, I think, Finding Ways Ahead in 2022. And then I guess sometime this year, another entity called Route 17 or Route 17, depending on where you learned your English. Can you give us a high-level introduction and overview of both of these entities and, what you're doing, what the mission is and what you're doing with that?
So when I left Natixis Investment Managers, and the reason for leaving was also I wanted to also become active in the academic world. So I became a senior fellow at the University of Zurich, the Center for Sustainable Finance and Private Wealth. I was also interested in implementing some of these ideas that I developed over time at Aegon, but also at Natixis Investment Managers. And this had to do with this observation that I had that a lot of what was happening in the world of responsible investment seemed to rely on the idea of kind of pointing fingers or blaming people or blaming companies. So if you think about exclusions, for example, that often seems to be about identifying bad companies and then kind of punishing them by divesting from them. There's obviously the whole taxonomy approach where the idea is, the taxonomy tells us what is green and nice, but it also tells us which is bad and brown. And then there's, scope 3 emissions reporting where it seems often more driven by the idea of kind of apportioning blame rather than solving a problem. It's like, we want to know who's responsible for getting these emissions out. And then it's always like a company. It's never us because we drive cars and we fly to Bali. No, it's an oil company. And, it seems to rely on this idea that if you can figure out who's bad or who's responsible for the bad behavior, then you can actually get them to stop doing this and somehow solve the problem. Although the mechanism that's involved is never quite clear. And so I think the world really just doesn't work that way. And so I wanted to approach things a little bit differently and try to figure out if I can help investors in getting clarity on their objectives first. And if it's more kind of, values alignment type stuff, or is it more, are you trying to manage risks, or are you trying to, contribute to a better world or have impact, whatever you call it. And then you select the evidence-based tools that will actually help them achieve those goals. And so you kind of turn it around, not so much pointing fingers or apportioning blame, but just working out ways ahead. And this, I borrowed this from a quote from Jane Goodall, famous primatologist. I listened to a podcast once, and she also talked about saving the environment or something. And she said, it's a whole area that we need to address, not by pointing fingers, but by working out ways ahead. And, so this resonated with me a lot. I thought, that's exactly what's happening. And so then I thought, good name for my advisory business would be Finding Ways Ahead. And so basically I work with investors, mostly pension funds, insurance companies, sometimes asset managers, and also sometimes kind of, NGOs or governmental agencies. But it's all to do with this idea of, sustainable finance, also climate change, impact investing. Why are we doing this? How should we do this? And then also to answer your question about Route 17, it's all kind of lumped together. This Route 17 is an extension of my work under Finding Ways Ahead. The main distinction is that in Route 17, I work together with Robert van Zwieten. He's another Dutchman, but he lives in the Philippines. Robert and I got to know each other sort of as I was leaving Natixis, and we shared an enthusiasm for blended finance, which was already very much kind of part of the solutions that I was working for under Finding Ways Ahead. And we basically decided to also start working together with a specific focus on blended finance. And so Robert brings a very lengthy track record in the world of development finance and investment banking.
So Route 17 is primarily focused on blended finance. And is that intermediary type of activity? Is that what that is?
It's basically anything under the header of making the marketplace for blended finance investments larger. That could be working on individual transactions, but it can also be working with parties who want to learn about blended finance, who want to convene. So, for example, we just did a symposium 2 weeks ago with Dimensional Fund Advisors, the asset management firm, where we brought together a group of about 50 people from government agencies, development banks, asset owners, academia, etc. It was a full day of kind of interactive discussion about what the barriers are to mobilizing private capital and to scaling up the blended finance marketplace.
You teach and publish as a senior fellow at the University of Zurich Center for Sustainable Finance and Private Wealth, as well as you are an ESG advisory committee member at the FCA in the UK. You, Harald Walkate, are a Renaissance man, and you lead a double life, one as a sustainable finance professional and the other as a very accomplished jazz pianist with 5 albums to your credit with your group, the New York Second. Is there a common thread that links sustainable finance and jazz for you?
Yeah, no, not really. These things are actually quite different and quite distinct. But no, that is true. You found me out. That's if I have time in the evenings, that's when I try to find my piano and do some playing and writing. At some point, I started bringing together musicians into the studio to actually record some of my compositions, and that it started as kind of a hobby, but you put these things out in Spotify, and actually people started noticing this, and we started getting pretty good reviews, and so it's kind of grown from there, and it's a lot of fun. Obviously I don't have to kind of do this to generate an income. And so it is purely a hobby in that sense, but it has given me an opportunity to work with some amazing musicians, and to be out there on Spotify and getting reviewed by international publications. It's been awesome just to experience that.
One of the few ESG and impact advisors, at least that I'm aware of, you have general high-level senior experience as a practitioner in the space. So you've been on both sides of the table, so how does your experience having worked at large asset management firms make you uniquely qualified to advise people? What do you bring from your experience that others who are lacking this experience can't?
I guess, so it's really important just to know how financial markets work. Also, I guess this is not only from my experience working with large asset management firms, but also from my University of Chicago experience. Actually, on the whole, financial markets aren't perfect, but they do work pretty well. I think it's good to have a healthy respect for financial markets. And so I think that's also what I often come across people who say, financial markets, it's all short-termist, or capitalism doesn't work and we should change the system. And I think having a certain appreciation for financial markets and the global system, again, it's not perfect. There's certainly stuff that we can do to improve, but it's been pretty good to us as sort of society, and also it works pretty well in terms of allocating capital to where there's opportunity and so forth. So I think that's the main thing, but also a second thing that's kind of related. It's really given me an opportunity to see how the large asset owners operate and how they make investment decisions, how they allocate capital. So it's obviously mostly the pension funds and insurance companies of the world, also to some degree sovereign wealth funds, although I've worked less with them. And here also, again, I think that, in the world of impact investing, I think there are broadly like 2 schools of thinking. One school is like, we have all these problems that we need to solve. We need money for that. And, pension funds, they have the deep pockets. So pension fund managers and board, trustees, board members should just kind of come to grips with this and see that they have to start spending money on these solutions. And it's kind of this mindset thing. We have to bang them over the head until they realize this. And I think if you have any experience working with pension funds, you realize that that's never going to work because that's not how the pension fund system typically is set up. The pension funds are set up to make sure that pension fund beneficiaries, when they retire, actually get paid a pension. And so that means that there's a certain investment strategy that they need to develop and follow. And, making large scale kind of, concessional investments, even if it does a great deal of good for the world, is probably not going to be on their agenda anytime soon. So the second school of thinking is then more like, okay, try to figure out how do pension funds work? How do they make decisions? And then, make investments that are tailored to these requirements. You can sort of summarize this as, change investments, not change investors. And I think it really requires spending a lot of time around these people, also with asset management firms who work for the pension funds, to really get a deep appreciation of how does the system work and why does it work? And also, why don't we just want to kind of change this? Even if it would be nice if you can release all these trillions for impact.
Your big lesson learned, let's say, from your leadership roles is let's create investments that are investable for these type of investors, as opposed to trying to hit them in the head.
It seems to me like that's, if you recognize the system we're all operating in, and you recognize that it's not likely to change anytime soon, then that is probably a better, more effective strategy, yes.
So then understanding the mind frame and how they have to answer to the investment committee, understanding that perspective is what you really bring to the table.
Yeah, I think so. And since I've become an independent consultant, I've worked with many pension funds, in particular also insurance companies, and I think this is appreciated when you sit at the table with these people, when they realize that you're not going to bang them over the head and say, hey, you should really be doing all of this kind of stuff, when it's like, okay, they see this guy understands more or less like who we are and what we do, and is going to help us or work with us to find solutions that fit with our with the way that we work and our set of requirements.
People who follow you on LinkedIn, or elsewhere will know that you're known for simplifying complex, sustainable finance topics into single slides. Given your focus on clear thinking and clear communication, what are the topics today that you think are the most misunderstood in ESG, sustainable finance, and impact investing?
There's so much. I think what really seems to be a common denominator in the topics that are misunderstood is kind of the change mechanisms. I think often I like to kind of take a step back in these discussions, anything to do with ESG or impact, and just really ask the question, okay, like, what are we really trying to do here? And it seems like often you come around to this idea of, okay, well, we're trying to have impact in some way. Even I think the whole ESG integration discussion started with this idea of, we need to figure out how to get investors involved in funding solutions and so forth. So at the end of the day, we're trying to kind of, solve problems or change things using investments. So I think fundamentally what people then need to understand is like, okay, well, what is then the change mechanism? And, so one of the things that is particularly topical now is the whole idea of using disclosure-based approaches. Obviously, a lot in the world of ESG, sustainable finance, especially in Europe today, revolves around disclosures. The thinking seems to be we want to fund solutions to problems like SDGs or the Paris Agreement, climate. And so what are we going to do? We're going to have more disclosure by companies and by investors so that we will see like what investments, what activities are then green or are sustainable. And then the thinking presumably is then investments will flow to those green or sustainable activities. And, to me, that just seems very wrong. Because I don't, again, based on my experience working with asset managers and asset owners, typically large investors do not allocate capital simply on the basis that it's categorized as green or sustainable. Maybe that will be helpful, or maybe it's part of the story, but typically they make investments based on, risk-return considerations. So if you have this whole disclosure-based initiative that we're in the middle of now with especially SFDR, and you're not really changing anything except that there's more information out there on what is considered to be sustainable, it's probably not going to do a lot to redirect capital flows. And, so to me, that seems completely obvious. And when the SFDR came out as a proposal, even before that, when the Sustainable Finance Action Plan came out, and when people said this, I thought, very soon people will kind of raise their hand and say, the world doesn't work like that, or financial markets don't work like that. And apparently, no one did, or not enough people did, because this all kind of went forward. Anyway, but so now we find ourselves in the middle of this situation, and there is going to be now a consultation on SFDR and some sort of assessment. But it seems like if you do more to fundamentally understand this change mechanism, you probably can avoid these kinds of, major distractions in terms of time and money and effort. To answer your question, I think just kind of change mechanisms generally is maybe the most understood in ESG.
Misunderstood, right?
Sorry, misunderstood.
If I distill everything you just said, at least when we're speaking of Europe, you're saying that we're kind of driving people into a box ticking type of mentality, and that isn't necessarily getting people to step back and think, what is the change that we're trying to accomplish with our investing activities? It's a bit of the tail wagging the dog.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. Yeah.
So I think that's probably very applicable to Europe, but what's going on with ESG in the US right now? How is that all going to resolve?
I think it's very interesting. And, speaking of disclosure, there's obviously quite a bit of disclosure-related activity as well with the SEC proposals in California. I think there was just a proposal, or maybe it was adopted already. In any case, so it's not like disclosure is exclusively a European thing. It does seem like there's a little bit more balanced thinking in the US about these things. Also, the SEC proposals did get a fair amount of pushback. So where it becomes difficult is that some of this pushback, I think, is in line with what I'm saying, which is, let's look at change mechanisms and evidence-based approaches, and, let's first be clear on what problem we're trying to solve, and is the SEC proposal then going to be, in our toolbox, is it going to be helpful, especially if we're talking about climate change, for example. The other side of this is that there's also a lot of pushback coming from that's more politically inspired, I think. It's a good way to put it, where it seems like, especially, on the political right, it seems like everything that has to do with ESG, addressing climate change and so forth, is suspicious and is therefore opposed. I do think that creates a very difficult environment, because I've also sometimes seen that if I analyze the SEC proposal regarding climate disclosures, for example, and I'm maybe criticizing parts of it, I think very quickly people think, it's like, well, wait a minute, is this more like a political job here? And you're just trying to make the argument more on sort of, analytical or scientific grounds. So it's making for a very confusing environment right now, where I think some people who probably also agree with me on the academic side, or some journalists, for example, are maybe afraid to speak out because they might then be lumped together with, the conservative crowd or the MAGA crowd or whatever. I don't think that that's very healthy or helpful if we want to, in fact, move forward and, find ways ahead. I think we should have a more, sort of common sense discussion about all this stuff. Again, what are the problems we're trying to solve? And the tools that are on the table, let's figure out, are they effective? Are they going to help us? Yes or no? And how do we prioritize them?
So if you were in the shoes of a U.S. manager, or say you're a large asset manager who has clients on both sides of the Atlantic, what should you do?
It's very tricky. I mean, it's really like a devil's dilemma, because, very simply said, in the US, you're now sort of discouraged from talking about ESG at all. And in Europe, it's still, the more you can talk about it, the better it is. Even though that's also, I think, now changing a little bit, perhaps also because of these discussions about the SFDR consultation in the UK. There's now also plans for a new labeling scheme, etc. So to your question, that's really difficult. If you can manage it as a global asset manager, you should probably kind of try to tailor as much as possible your narrative to these different markets, without obviously becoming sort of inconsistent in your approach. But I think for a lot of managers, that's going to be very tricky. And so the end result might be that they just say, like, let's just keep our head down. If in the US we can't, talk about it very much, let's just not talk about it at all and hope this kind of blows over.
You hail from University of Chicago, Booth School of Business, known everywhere for evidence-based, rigorous thinking. What do you see as the best evidence that should persuade a skeptical, evidence-focused finance professional that the ESG toolkit includes tools that enhance returns?
If we think of evidence, then I see evidence more as kind of the academic research or the body of research, scientific evidence. This is also one of the things, also because of my Chicago education, when I started looking into ESG, I immediately started looking at the academic literature. This is also something I was doing for corporate strategy and mergers and acquisitions. And, it's nice to kind of know that whatever approaches you were pursuing have some grounding in the academic research, where academics have kind of tested these ideas and have collected data on them and have run some regressions on them, and you kind of get some guidance on like what's working, what's not working. And so with ESG, over the 15 or 20 years or so that we've been talking about this term or responsible investment, there's a huge body of evidence now on all of these different approaches: ESG integration, engagement, tilting, green bonds, impact investment, and so forth. I try to follow the new research as much as possible. Now, to your question, I wouldn't say that necessarily all of this evidence can persuade skeptical people that the ESG toolkit includes tools that enhance returns or impact, because actually some of the academic evidence is quite clear that some of these tools that we have do not, in fact, yield higher returns or impact. But so if you want to talk, for example, about a tool that does seem to work, which is engagement or active ownership, that body of evidence is certainly very helpful because it's been very extensively studied. The research gives us a lot of guidance on what kind of engagement can actually work, what the approaches are that are actually effective. It basically allows you to manage your expectations of what you can expect, because you're also on engagement. There are a lot of people who say, oh, we want to have impact on the world. There's the SDGs, for example. Okay, well, let's engage on this. And it sort of assumes that large listed companies can deliver like all of these things that we need, all these solutions that we need to meet the SDGs, for example. So I think if that's your expectation, you're going to engage your way to meeting the SDGs, then you're probably not going to get very far. But if you have more realistic expectations of what you can do in terms of improving governance in companies, for example, then that's a fantastic tool, and there's lots of evidence to back that up.
Are we able to effectively measure impact? We seem to be very selective about where we're gathering data and measuring and ignoring some other aspects that are involved, oftentimes not comparing apples with apples in terms of really measuring impact. Is the evidence there?
I don't think the evidence is there, unfortunately. I think it's very problematic. And going back to your question about the evidence, so actually I just did a project for a client, and then they're actually interested in seeing if we can also publish these findings somehow. So I might be able to actually post this on LinkedIn at some point. So what I did for them is to look at the evidence, academic evidence, but also kind of the quasi-academic evidence, because there's a lot of approaches also including blended finance, for example, where there isn't that much academic evidence yet. But you're trying to kind of figure out, like, what's the narrative? So what are the change mechanisms? What do we know from the academic literature actually works? And what can we surmise will work from all of the credible narrative around it? And so I basically put together this overview saying, okay, well, here are the tools that we are talking about under the header of ESG. And this is what the academic evidence says about whether or not they will be effective. And one of the things that I introduced to kind of help explain my findings was an analogy that I called the three-stage rocket analogy. And so the idea is that in a 3-stage rocket, basically you launch a rocket, and then at some point the second stage of the rocket ignites, and the first rocket drops to the Earth. And then further on, there's like a 3rd-stage rocket. So there's another rocket that ignites, and then the second part falls to the Earth. And I think it's a very appropriate analogy, because often with ESG tools, you need to think about these 3 stages. So for example, there's a lot of discussion about tilting. You can tilt your portfolios towards good companies or away from bad companies. And the idea is that you will then impact the cost of capital of these companies. And so there's a lot of research on this. Some people say, oh, tilting really works. Other people say, it doesn't really work. On balance, it seems like tilting can work to influence the cost of capital. But so my point there is, a lot of people then say, okay, so tilting is a good tool for your responsible investments. And so my analogy then shows, okay, yes, for your 1st-stage rockets, that's correct, because you've impacted the cost of capital. Now, let's see about the 2nd stage, because what you want, ideally, is for the company then to change in some way. So the change in the cost of capital should create an incentive for the management to do something differently or to not do something. And so there, the evidence is actually much less persuasive, because there are all kinds of incentives on management. Sometimes management don't even know exactly what their cost of capital is or whether it's gone up or gone down. And then the crucial question is, and that's kind of the 3rd stage of the 3-stage rocket. Ultimately, we're doing this because we hope that it's going to somehow impact this broader systemic change. So if we talk about climate change, for example, you want to do tilting so that you change the cost of capital in companies, so that companies are incentivized to do less emissions, so that overall emissions decline and we save the world from climate change. And so that's kind of the theory of change. But so if you then look at the literature, you see, okay, yeah, 1st-stage rockets, often you can check that box. 2nd-stage rockets, usually much less clear. On the 3rd stage, there's usually no data whatsoever. And so to your question, you can't really measure this stuff, and certainly not using sort of, quantitative tools, unfortunately.
Is that the way it's always going to be?
Well, not necessarily, because I think, so one of the things I'm also now working on with the people at the University of Zurich is this idea of impact measurement. And so what are we really trying to measure when we talk about impact measurement? I think we should be talking much more about assessing impact, and it has to do also with this idea of causality and additionality. Much of what's happening today in the world of impact measurements is just on trying to figure out, is there some sort of change? And then can we quantify that change? Did the company's emissions go down, yes or no? For example, there's hardly any emphasis on this question of, did our investment actually cause that change? And also the question, would the change have happened regardless of our investment? Is there additionality? So obviously these things are very difficult to capture, because you don't have an additionality factor that has been developed by some consulting firm or something like that. There isn't the causality index that you can just kind of Google this, what's the degree of causality between, doesn't work that way. But, obviously, again, going back to what we were talking about earlier, if you understand the overall change mechanism, then you can sort of approach it. You can figure out, okay, how likely is my investment to cause some sort of change? And is that the type of change that is needed to address this bigger problem? And so I think if we can change our thinking about impact measurements and talk more about, theories of change, these more qualitative stories, and then underpinning it with, evidence, then I think we're in a much better position already.
You've written a lot and spoken previously a lot about what you call labeling versus enabling. I'd first like to get into the distinction between sustainable finance versus financing sustainability. Tell me the difference between sustainable finance versus financing sustainability.
There is a funny story about the definitions, because this is, I'm sure you recognize this, from the moment that I've been involved in ESG, responsible investment, and especially impact investment, there's been this debate, we should agree on the definition of impact investing. And I think here the thinking seems to be is like, well, once we're agreed on it, then we can move forward and really make a difference. But first we have to agree on it, because otherwise it's going to be all over the map. And so I always found that funny, where, in impact investing conferences, there would always be like a significant amount of time allocated to discussing, different definitions of impact investing. And so I was invited to a conference in Zurich many years ago, and I was going to be on a panel discussion about impact investing. So I was sitting there, already much of the day, and as was, common at that time and probably still is, there was a lot of discussion already about the definition of impact investing. And I was sitting next to a guy, I don't remember at all who it was, but we had a little bit of conversation. And at some point he leaned over to me and he said, if there's one more conversation about the definition of impact investing, I'm going to shoot myself. And so I kind of, sort of nodded. And then like a minute or so after that, the panel that was taking place was wrapped up and I was called to the stage. And the guy who was moderating the panel introduced the panelists and said, okay, well, Harald, let's start with you. And, before we get into, the bigger conversation about impact investing, tell me, what's your definition of impact investing? And so I said, well, I remember actually who it was Howdy Hummels. I said, well, Harry, I would love to tell you, but I should warn you, there was a guy in the audience who just told me if there's one more discussion about the definition of, he's going to shoot himself. And so there was lots of laughter, obviously, but also that was kind of a nice way for me to kind of, get out of that discussion and to, get into more the nuts and bolts of, what are we really trying to do? Anyway, but so that aside, on the sustainable finance and financing sustainability, this to me is not really sort of about definitions or coining new terms or anything like that. It just seems to me that, what we have now started calling sustainable finance, which is everything under the header of ESG, impact investing and so forth, often doesn't really seem to have a whole lot to do anymore with financing sustainability, which is, when I think about it, and often when I have these conversations with other people, I think when it comes down to it, that's sort of what we're trying to do here. We want sustainability, then we're trying to work out how to finance it, how to fund SDGs, how to fund renewable energy, how to fund, whatever. And so it seems to me that there's a lot happening in the world of sustainable finance, but it doesn't seem to be doing a whole lot to actually finance sustainability. So which is why I make this distinction. And I think also in how I work with clients, I often bring this up because I do think we're kind of in a shift now. And there's a lot of signals that seem to kind of support this, where, you could also call it, sustainable finance 1.0 going to sustainable finance 2.0 or whatever. In any case, it seems like a lot of people are asking a lot of questions about how effective is all of this stuff that we're doing. If the point is to fund solutions to, sustainability related issues, then a lot of people are saying, we're not actually that effective. And so if we want to become more effective, we should probably shift our focus towards the tools that are in fact effective. And so that's, I think, where the sustainable financing sustainability distinction can be very helpful.
How does this relate then to the labeling versus enabling, where ESG practitioners end up being more focused on generating data than acting on that data?
It's all the same thing, really. I come up with different terms to talk about these things in a way that people will kind of understand it. So specifically how it relates, sustainable finance today to a very, very large extent is all about labeling. And, literally putting labels on products, but also labels as in, quantifying things, measuring things, coming up with metrics for things, doing reporting. It's all kind of, writing a TCFD report, for example, is also just a matter of labeling. You're trying to put labels on processes or investments and saying, they're green, or are they kind of transition aligned or Paris aligned? And all of this labeling activity is keeping us all very busy, is also costing us a lot of money. But people rarely ask the question of, what is all of this labeling supposed to enable? And so in that sense, the enabling links to the idea of financing sustainability. The idea is, to me at least, that we're trying to enable these solutions using finance. At the same time, what we're doing mostly is not so much enabling. We're just spending our days putting labels on stuff. And I don't think it's very helpful.
We've discussed how ESG-focused regulations are increasingly being coalesced around and rolled out in Europe, and this is increasing ESG data availability. There's more and more providers. So is this situation that you just described getting better, or is it getting worse?
I don't know. I see different signals here. Sometimes I'm encouraged because I'll read something about SFDR or CSRD, and people will say, well, let's have another think, like, why are we really doing this? But then I see other signals that, we're still doubling down on this. And, for example, I was reading earlier today, SFDR, as we discussed earlier, there's a consultation announced now on SFDR by the EU. Yeah, I think this is healthy because we've introduced this piece of legislation a couple of years ago. You kind of want to know if it's working. Is it doing what we were hoping it was going to do? Also, there's been quite a lot of criticism, especially that, instead of addressing greenwashing, it might have facilitated more greenwashing. I find that an encouraging sign that there's some sort of assessment then on, is this labeling or is it actually enabling something? But then when I looked at the consultation question, I didn't really see a lot of questions that kind of, get to the heart of the issue. It was more like, do we have the right classifications, or should we maybe tinker with Article 8 and Article 9 requirements, or maybe just come up with new classifications? But the basic underlying premise of, we're going to do disclosure and somehow that will lead to some sort of magic change, that doesn't seem to be addressed. So in the consultation, I'm sure we can kind of raise these questions as well. But it doesn't appear that they've already kind of started thinking about these sorts of things at the EU level. So that's a signal that maybe it's not going as well as I was hoping.
But are there sectors or asset classes where you see more enabling taking place presently?
One of the things that I find very encouraging is that, so I told you earlier about this work that we're doing with Route 17 with my partner, Robert van Zwieten. And so that's mostly focused on blended finance approaches. And so what we find very encouraging is that there's a lot of interest across the spectrum, development banks, but also importantly, asset managers and asset owners in, learning more about this because, it requires a certain level of awareness that we're not going to solve the world's problems by hoping that people will put their money into these solutions and these investments. Most of the investments needed to address the SDGs, for example, are not going to provide market rate returns today. And so we'll need some sort of subsidy element if we still want to do those investments. Once you get that insight and you say, okay, well, there's apparently a way to do this. It's called blended finance. Let's start looking into that. Then that's a signal to me that we're kind of moving in the right direction where you really want to enable outcomes. Might still be very complex and you may end up not doing it because you might say it's like, okay, well, this obviously doesn't fit our requirements, not for us. But the fact that people are seriously looking at this issue and looking at a potential role in it, that's very encouraging to me.
Let's talk about what happens when you advise a client who wants to implement some aspect of a responsible investment program, implementing ESG. Where do you start with your clients? What questions do you ask in your first conversation? Maybe you could take me through some real life examples of what your process has been in the past.
It's a very good question. I don't really have a one size fits all approach, also because the type of projects I get involved in tend to be sort of quite different. But the one common factor is that I always try to start with defining the objective. I think what is very important to me is just being clear about, means and ends. What are we trying to do here? And so, for example, on your net zero portfolio or initiative. So that is a good example, because there's obviously a lot of talk about net zero and climate related investments and so forth. So often this conversation starts because some company has made a net zero commitment. And, so it's like, hey, we signed up to this thing. Now, can you help us implement it? And so, it's a very interesting question. Like, why did you sign up to this thing? And that in itself can be like an entire consulting assignment, because often it's not really quite clear why companies sign up to these things. And there's a lot of sort of herd behavior or peer pressure. Commercial pressure can be, very strong, because it's, pension funds will say things like, we will no longer work with asset managers who have not made a net zero commitment. Now, of course, what all asset managers will do, at least all asset managers who care about inflows, will say, oh, okay, let's do that then. And then later we'll worry about, like how we actually evidence this, or what kind of data we need for this, or, so it's often, and I've only been in this situation once or twice, but if the decision is still on the table, I typically say, okay, well, don't make any decision until you figure it out, like why you're actually doing this. But so the next step is then to determine, okay, well, to what extent can you actually live up to these commitments? Because I wrote an article about this with Tom Gosling. The article is called What G Fans Should Have Said. It's basically to try to explain that a lot of what is typically in these commitments, in these documents that explain what you've kind of signed up for, is nearly impossible to deliver on, or at least it's nearly impossible or completely impossible to measure these things. And so going back to what we were talking about earlier, one of the things you basically commit to is, to invest in line with a 1.5 degree scenario. And there's no one who can really say, how you evidence that or how you objectively measure that. Because, for a couple of reasons. One, we have no idea if we're actually going to reach a 1.5 degree scenario. And if we do, it's going to be in, the year 2050, and no one has any idea of what the economy is going to look like then, other than that, presumably it would be 1.5 degree aligned. And, so you cannot invest in line with a 1.5 degree scenario, today in 2023, if we only know in, 2050 what that is going to look like. There are all kinds of practical problems to deal with then. But then usually that leads to this question of, what is ultimately the purpose of this, leaving aside the commercial drivers. And then usually it's like, well, we want to, contribute to making a better world, and, we all have a responsibility. And then typically that leads to, the tools that we have in our toolbox that are in fact effective, that we know based on the, academic evidence that we just talked about. So that leads them to things like, well, there's engagement as a tool that you can use. How are you doing engagement? Like, what are your expectations there? But also, how are you resourcing that? And it's things like impact investing. Typically you'll then get into these questions around blended finance, where it's like, yeah, we would love to invest in all of this stuff, but, there simply isn't enough deal flow there. Or, yeah, we'd like to invest in emerging markets, but, we don't really have an emerging markets allocation, or we think the risks are just too high in sub-Saharan Africa. And then that will get you into the question of like, well, could blended finance then be a solution for you? Anyway, so if you start with the objectives, then you can kind of work your way through the whole thread and touch on all of these things. And then you end up deciding on some sort of approach or combination of approaches that they're comfortable with.
The first thing is to clarify the objective. And how do you do that?
It doesn't need to be quantifiable. I mean, it can be helpful to really articulate it, but it's usually a less kind of tangible process. It's also usually, it's not like an email exchange or, a Zoom call where you kind of, check the box on that question. It can be more of a process or internal debate. And so, for example, I did a project once with a Dutch pension fund board. They had already made a commitment to invest towards a number of SDGs. They wanted to do sort of like a 3-hour workshop to really kind of understand impact investing better. and to understand like, okay, well, what are the things that we can actually do? And here we also talked about, the different types of impact investing. So without getting into all the detail there's sort of, impact aligned investing, where you're investing in companies that are somehow impactful, but it could be listed companies, for example, where your investment doesn't actually go into the company. It's not like you're enabling additional impact. It's just you're kind of associated with the company because you're invested in, you hold their shares and they're doing something impactful. So that would be impact aligned investments. Not necessarily anything wrong with it, but it's a little bit different from what I would call impact generating investments, where you're finding some company or project or people who want to do something impactful, but don't have the money. And so you give them the money, you invest in the company, and then say, thank you for the money. Now we can undertake our impactful activities. You've generated or enabled that impact. And so we kind of had that discussion with the pension fund board. And they said, oh, that's interesting. We've never really had this discussion, but that makes a lot of sense to us. But so now when we were thinking about this and talking about this for 3 hours in this workshop, kind of people going back and forth on this, at the end they kind of agreed that, it should really mean this impact generating type of investment. Otherwise, like, what are we doing it for? Yeah, it's nice. You can say, hey, look at our portfolio. We have all, the allocation to all these very impactful firms, but, we shouldn't be claiming that we allowed this to happen. Anyway, so to your question, it can be more that kind of process. And then also these people actually invited me back 2 or 3 months after that because they said, yeah, we had further discussions on this. Yeah, we think we should really be looking more for this impact generating type stuff. You talked about blended finance. That seems interesting to us. Can you show us some examples of how that works? So there, it seemed like over the course of half a year or so, there was kind of more clarity in their thinking about, what is our objective here as pension fund.
And then what was the next step after that? If people want to achieve something, how do they move now from identifying, clarifying, into actual execution and implementation? Yeah,
so in this particular pension fund, there has not yet been a next step. Maybe there will be. I think if they were to ask me what would the next step be, I would probably say, okay, let's try to find 1 or 2 of these transactions or funds that you can then put some money in or at least work together with and kind of, get your feet dirty. And you can see then what it's like. There are a couple of blended finance vehicles out there that are very large and that are sort of designed with institutional investors or pension funds in mind. Some of them are looking for new funding. So, you don't have to put 500 million in. You could start with 5 or 50. And, you get a taste of, okay, what kind of people are they? There's some very reputable asset managers or investment banks out there who have these vehicles. And so this is all kind of tried and tested. And, sometimes you kind of need to see that to become a little bit more comfortable. Because often if people think like, well, yeah, we're going to be funding activities in sub-Saharan Africa, wind farms, we've never allocated any money to, sub-Saharan Africa. If you actually sit at the table with people who are based in the Netherlands or in Germany or wherever, actually have, extensive track record working with development banks, putting wind farms or, solar farms into these countries on the ground. It's all operational. It's actually making money. They have guarantees in place from governments. That will give you a lot more comfort, I think, as pension fund board to say, it's like, okay, yeah, this seems like the type of thing that, meets our requirement of impact generating investments. Let's try this. And then, let's do 1 or 2. You don't have to allocate the entire portfolio all in one go.
So that's deployment. And then, of course, they have to create a team or someone's got to be responsible for that. And then they have to create feedback evaluation loops to measure what the hell happened.
Ideally, yes. I think you probably don't need to build separate teams for this. So obviously it depends a little bit of how you're organized. And some pension fund organizations can be quite bare bones if they've kind of outsourced everything to external asset managers. But so usually there are 1 or 2 people at least trying to figure out how do we allocate our capital? If you're doing, for example, blended finance allocation, that is often not very different from a sovereign debt allocation, for example, or an infrastructure allocation. Might even be with the same or similar kind of asset management firm you're already working with. You definitely don't need like a dedicated person or a team for stuff like that. If you want to go all out and say, hey, we've now tried this and we now want to make our entire portfolio impact generating, then you probably want to have one or two people working on this assignment.
So would you say most people put their foot first in the water before jumping all the way in?
They should. I think, yeah, definitely. That's, in my experience, what smart pension funds will do, yes.
You keep bringing up blended finance. A lot of your present work in thought leadership seems to be focused on blended finance. But blended finance isn't really new, and it's been around in one form or another for a long time. So why are you putting so much energy into the space?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Well, I think because it's needed. And as we've been talking here about sustainable finance and financing sustainability, I think actually maybe in some ways the advent of sustainable finance has created a bit of a distraction from blended finance. So blended finance, even we might not always have called it that, has been a tool that we've been using for decades, if not centuries. It's basically the idea where, the public and the private sector invest together. And the fact that the public sector has a certain allocation or stake or guarantee allows the private sector to come in. I read a book about how France or how Paris was kind of, developed over the centuries. And there are examples of, already in the 16th, 17th century of kings, French kings working out clever ways of bringing in like rich people to fund bridges and infrastructure and, entire sections of the city. That's effectively what we're doing here as well. And so there's, as you say, there's nothing new under the sun. The reasons I spend so much time on it is that it does require bringing together these different parties, and it is relatively complex. So it requires dedicated work. But again, as I just said, it's also because the whole sustainable finance world is off, with the disclosure-based labeling work. And I'm trying to kind of convince them that they should redirect their focus here, where this is where the real action is or should be.
You have a front row view on regulatory efforts in ESG, you being a member of the UK Financial Regulators ESG Advisory Committee. Can you give me a shortcut, Cliff's note, bird's eye view on where this is going?
There are, in fact, limits, of course, to what I can say, but it has been a pleasure to work with the people at the FCA. So they launched this advisory committee last year in December. It's a pretty small committee, and it's effectively independent people. So I think this is already kind of a compliment to them. So they've purposely left out representatives from the asset management industry, I think. And so I think that probably makes sense. Even though they're wonderful people who work in the asset management industry, I was obviously one of them for many years. You do come with a set of incentives, basically. So I think they wanted to avoid that. And so conversations we've had with the FCA, and this is a very large group of people that is brought into these meetings, including the senior leadership, so that I'm always impressed that there seems to be real interest in what we have to tell them. And what has also been good and also fun is just to be very frank about what we think. And so we're also encouraged to really speak our mind. This leads to very interesting discussions. I think so. It's not a secret that they have plans to launch a set of sustainability disclosure requirements, also called SDR. So there's also been a consultation on this. So can't talk about the details, but it's the plan is for that to come out in the fourth quarter of this year. And, based on what is already public in this consultation, but also based on what I've seen, I think this is a very sensible approach that they're taking. Also already taking into account more sort of this objective or objectives of sustainable funds, certainly much more than what SFDR does. So that's, I think, taking this disclosure in more of the right direction. Also, they're working on the idea of providing more evidence-based guidance to investment advisors, kind of recognizing the important role that investment advisors have in all of this. Also, in terms of trying to figure out what our end consumers actually looking for? Or, when we tell them, sustainable ESG impact, what is actually happening in their mind? What does that make them think or expect? And I think personally that often consumers expect a very high degree of sort of causality or additionality. The way these funds are often presented, it's not very explicit, but it's basically we have a significant problem with climate change or the SDGs, and here is a sustainable fund that you can invest in. I think most people then think like, oh, apparently if I invest in this fund, that causes some sort of improvements on the planet or in our world.
We're all going to live happily ever after.
Yes, exactly. And I think so there's discussion about that at the FCA also. So how do we get more information on that? Can we have better dialogue with consumers about what kind of expectations they have from these products? Can we design labels or rules that take that sort of thing into account? So that maybe gives you some idea of where they're going with this.
If you had to name the one single most important challenge to financing sustainability at this time, what would it be?
Probably, I would say getting asset owners to put more of their money where their mouth is. So many, at least asset owners, certainly in Europe, have made big commitments to things like impact investing, transition finance, SDGs. But then when it comes to the work and the cooperation with governments, for example, that this requires, then they can sometimes be missing in action.
What do you know now about responsible investment and financing sustainability that you wish you had known in 2009 when you started working in this area at Aegon?
Probably that it can be very helpful to start by getting clarity on objectives in any discussion about responsible investment or ESG.
You don't have to name names, but can you describe to me an example of an investment that you were convinced of at the time your firm invested and that it ticked all of your ESG boxes, but in the end it didn't turn out? And what was the lesson learned from that experience?
I would say probably microfinance investments more generally, and it's a bit of a nuanced story. I wouldn't say I thought they were going to check all my boxes, but I did think that they would be impactful and that they would meet institutional investor requirements. I think on both counts, I was a little bit disappointed.
So what did you learn from that?
So on the impact side, at that time, I did a lot of reading about what we know of the actual sort of impact of microfinance, and it's really hard to pin down. There isn't really much hard evidence that it contributes to kind of alleviating poverty or better social outcomes. The evidence is more anecdotal. You would think, I'm still sort of mildly positive about it, but you think that, so many years in, we would have a little bit more of a feel for, where can this help us or how can this help us? And on the sort of the financial or the return side, it seemed like after we had made this investment and you get all the reporting, it was difficult sometimes to really kind of get comfortable with the risk that seemed to be higher or at least different than what we had anticipated. A lot of stuff kept popping up. It's like, oh, well, now we have this issue in this country, and then now we have this issue in that country. And then we thought, okay, the idea was that we would make an investment that was already more kind of, institutional investor friendly.
Now the converse of that, can you describe an investment that you were skeptical of, either at the time your firm invested or maybe ultimately you didn't invest and you passed on it, and in the end, it turned out way better than you thought? What did you learn from that experience?
I think that would probably be a blended finance investment. So actually, I won't name the actual fund, but so I've been doing a lot of reading about blended finance, and I thought, okay, it sounds good, but I was still a little bit skeptical. And then along came this opportunity to not only invest in a blended finance vehicle, but actually to help kind of structure it a little bit. And so I became involved in this process, and that really gave me a lot of insight into the moving parts and also the things I was a little bit skeptical about. So I was like, oh, this is how that works. And you can actually put that together, and then, okay, you get your guarantee to come in here And so I think, the fact that I'm so enthusiastic about blended finance today is in large part because I had that opportunity to kind of test it back then, and also kind of to take away some of my concerns.
And if someone wants to get into financing sustainability, how would you advise them to get in the business?
I get this question very often. I always advise people just to find a regular kind of, investment or, financial job, trading bonds, for example, or managing, an equity portfolio, or maybe working for a pension fund, just kind of, working on their capital allocation team. What you really need to be effective in this area is just a very solid understanding of how financial markets work and how capital is allocated. And I think that's really the only way to do that is to just get, to work in mainstream finance for 5 years, 10 years.
Get a good foundation in the fundamentals.
Yeah.
Because sustainable finance without a good fundamental financial return isn't going to sustain anything.
Well, exactly. And also, we started out discussing University of Chicago, Milton Friedman, and I think a lot of people seem to be betting on this idea that we're going to overturn capitalism. And, if you go into impact investing now, then, in a couple of years, the whole world will come to your firm instead of to BlackRock. I don't think if it's going to happen, it's not going to happen anytime soon. So I think you're better off kind of betting on the financial system and capitalism as we know it now to continue for a while and just become very effective within that system. And then I think you'll also become very effective in figuring out how you can finance sustainability.
Harald, it was great to talk with you.
Likewise.
Thank you very much, my friend, for taking me through all this. I really appreciate it. Tell everybody your websites and social accounts and all that good stuff.
We have a very nice website that's called route17.world, which is where we have a lot of thought leadership and fantastic sources on blended finance. There's my own website. It's called findingwaysahead.com. And then obviously everyone can find me on LinkedIn.
Okay. And what's the best way for people to contact you?
LinkedIn seems to work pretty well.
Thank you very much, Harald.
Thank you, Scott.
Goodbye, everybody.
You've been listening to SRI 360. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button and subscribe to get future episodes. You can find an archive of all previous podcast interviews and more articles and information on SRI, ESG, impact investing, sustainable investing, and socially responsible investing at our website, sri360.com. If you'd like to read more lessons learned from world-class SRI investors, get a copy of Scott Arnell's book, Sustainable and Responsible Investing 360. It's a must-read for anyone wanting to know more about investing for positive social, environmental, and ethical impact, all with market financial returns. These are the stories and tactics of those leading the way as sustainable and responsible investing goes mainstream. Sustainable and Responsible Investing 360 is now available in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook format wherever books are sold.